When we think of European and American portraiture of the 18th and early 19th centuries, what do we usually picture? We most likely will jump straight to something by Thomas Gainsborough, such as Mr. and Mrs. Andrews here. This beautifully dressed couple is positioned in the foreground, and a magnificently picturesque pastoral background, encompasses the rest of the scene. Mr. Andrews stands with his loyal dog at his side, while Mrs. Andrews takes up the entire bench with her very large gown. Hey, there we go. Or we might think of American artist Thomas Sully and his portrait of Fanny Kemble. This dramatic portrait, which is part of the DAR collection, focuses on the actress Frances Ann Kemble, who Sully painted numerous times. Each portrait does what the sitter and artist intended. They convey a likeness and a message about who these people are, what they stood for, and in some cases, how they viewed themselves in society. They are representations of these individuals. It should probably be no surprise that King George thinks that he himself is better than all the rest in his portrait. But what happens when we look more closely at portraits from the long 18th century and notice African figures subtly and overtly placed within them? How do we view them with our modern eyes? How does our perception of these images change? This afternoon, we will take a brief look at portraits and paintings that contain images of enslaved and free Africans and some of the symbolism that's conveyed in these depictions. Enslaved and free Africans were not new to portraits and paintings by the 18th century. Their inclusion during this time added to the growing symbolism found in portraits. The enslaved African came more to symbolize the growing European or the growing empire and a byproduct early in the Enlightenment. The inclusion of Africans in portraits dates back several centuries. 16th century Italian artist Paris Bordone included an African page or servant in this portrait of a gentleman wearing a suit of armor. 17th century English artist Gilbert Jackson painted Daughter of Florence Poulet and Thomas Smith around 1640, and included in this portrait is her African page, who greatly contrasts her pure whiteness with his dark skin tone. Even the celebrated Anthony van Dyck included African figures in his paintings. When he painted William Fielding, 1st Earl of Denby's portrait in 1633, he included an African servant in a fine silk robe with a silk turban and set them in an exotic landscape. Looking at these images, we begin to see trends emerge. We see African figures intentionally positioned, and they are dressed in such a way that they look very European, yet stand out on their own. These elements are signs of how the sitter or buyer aimed to represent this or his or her lifestyle. This is their way of saying who they were in society and where they believed they stood. Today, I would like to look at two things that stand out in these portraits. We will look closely today at posture and how they portray a sense of superiority and admiration in portraits. And we will look at the use of clothing and accessories to place the enslaved figure in a hierarchy. So first, let's start by looking at clothing and accessories. While white slave owners used enslaved Africans as a status symbol and dressed them in such a way as to make the enslaved figure appear more exotic. This practice is believed to stem from booming interest in science during the Enlightenment. During the 18th century, Great Britain and much of the Western world underwent what we all know today as the Enlightenment. This included advancements in science and in understanding the greater world. This is the same time period that witnessed great growth in publications on subjects such as natural history and light and color theory. Wealthy English and American society latched on to this new scientific craze and popularized it through their support of scientific publications and explorations and collecting exotic plants and animals from abroad. Likewise, free and enslaved Africans became status symbols and viewed as exotic new creatures by Western elites. And this can be seen in a number of paintings from the time. And take, for example, this portrait miniature of an unidentified young man in the British art collection, in the Yale British Art Collection, excuse me. Attributed to Bernard Lenz, this young servant wears a silk coat and a silk waistcoat with silver thread buttonholes and a turban topped with a feather. His exotic headdress typifies the livery, part of the livery found on enslaved and free African figures in paintings. This livery was specifically for those servants who worked in close proximity to members of a wealthy family. This served as a means for these families to exhibit their interest and subtly convey what they believed to be their command of nature. Well-to-do families had African figures immortalized in paintings, such as Arthur Davis's painting John Ord, his wife Anne, and his eldest son William from circa 1754. Here we see the matriarch and patriarch of the family comfortably seated at a table, while two other members of the family look on from above. Behind John and Anne is a mantel filled with blue and white Chinese export porcelain, and a romantic landscape scene draws the viewer's eyes up from there. To Anne's left is her stepson William offering up his kill, and just behind him is his enslaved African servant. The servant is dressed in typical livery for the mid-18th century, but he stands out even more with that silk turban. This is Ord's way of saying that his family is not only worldly, but can afford exotic expenses as part of their lifestyle. And just as a side note, Davis, the artist, charges for every figure that he paints into these portraits. So the fact that he included the African figure in this is a testament to the value of the expense in painting him. We see the inclusion of African servants in numerous paintings from the 18th century. Gowan Hamilton's circa 1730s group portrait of the Raikes family included an African servant alongside a white servant. And it might be a little hard to see with the lighting here, but we have the African servant here along with the white servant. The African servant's inclusion into the painting not only serves as a status symbol, but also places the African figure in a hierarchy. Notice how he is relegated off to the far left part of the painting, and often to the shadows even. Here he is a status symbol and an exotic part of the household because of his inclusion, but at the same time he is kept at a distance from the family. Same goes for this circa 1740s French painting entitled A Game of Quadrille. Fashionable people sit around a table playing a card game while being attended to by a female servant, while an African servant waits off again in the shadows over here. The servant in this circa 1708 portrait of Elihu Yale, the second Duke of Devonshire, Lord James Cavendish, and Thomas Tunstall, is also dressed elegantly and wears a cap, much like the other images we have seen. His inclusion is not only interesting because of his presence and attire, but also because of the source of Yale's wealth. During the late 17th century, Yale oversaw the slave trading activities for part of the East India Company. This servant's inclusion is almost a way of saying that Yale gets his wealth from the slave trade and enjoys the spoils of it too. And then another interesting note here for this one is that the children and dance master here in the background were added later. So again, that reinforces the idea that including the African figure was more worthwhile expense up front. This practice became so commonplace that popular satirist William Hogarth satirized it in his print Taste in High Life. Here we see a black servant, again dressed in that very fine livery with a silk turban feather, being attended to by a fashionable lady. Everything about this print mocks fashionable society. Hogarth marks the elite's display of wealth by poking fun at their choice of fashion, their means of transportation, their taste in expensive ceramics, and their use of the African boy almost as an exotic plaything. And there are so many more things we can point out about this where that Hogarth is making fun of, but we didn't want to cover it with red arrows all the way. One other feature I wanted to point out real quick that leads into my next point is an accessory that is seen in some of these portraits, and that is the collar. There's no beating around the bush here. This accessory meant control. This feature can be seen in the Elihu Yale portrait we just saw, one by Bartholomew Dandridge, which we will see again shortly, and numerous others. The use of African figures in portraits came to be synonymous with wealth and status. Fashionable society viewed African servants as exotic, which made them ideal accessories for people of status. The other aspect I wanted to touch on today is how posture and positioning of African figures in portraits also places them in a hierarchy. So first, let's look at this circa 1782 portrait of Charles Stanhope, the 3rd Earl of Harrington by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Here, Stanhope is standing front and center as a battle rages on in the background. Stanhope is dressed in what appears to be a suit of armor, with a red sash around his shoulder and a sword in his right hand. Stanhope's confidence amidst the turmoil around him is further reinforced by his relaxed posture and calm gaze. To his left is a young African boy holding Stanhope's helmet. The boy appears to be racing towards Stanhope and wears a green jacket with red facings, collar, and cuffs. The expression on his face is one of awe and wonder. What is interesting to note here is how the boy is postured. Notice how he was looking up at Stanhope. This type of posturing or positioning in the 18th century was very intentional. It was a way of showing a hierarchy of individuals, and is something that we see frequently when it comes to race. And now you might be thinking to yourself, well, of course, William, everyone will look at Stanhope that way. He's so tall and dreamy. And all that is fine and true, right? But let's take a look at another portrait from about 5 decades earlier. This circa 1725 portrait, entitled A Young Girl with a Dog and a Page by Bartholomew Dandridge, shows us how 18th century figures viewed hierarchy in their life. Here, the young girl is seen in full length in the full foreground while petting a dog. She is well dressed, and her dog wears a collar inscribed with what is believed to be the name of her father. Behind them, in the shaded background, is an enslaved figure carrying a basket of peaches and grapes. The hierarchy here can be read in 2 ways. The girl is the primary figure in this painting. Secondary figure could go either to the dog or the page. For the dog, the dog is in the foreground, the page is in the background, therefore making the dog second. But if read from top to bottom, which was common in the 18th century, the African figure becomes the secondary and the dog the third figure. But no matter which way you look at it, the enslaved figure is placed in an inferior status. And he is in the same posture that we saw in the Stanhope portrait. Despite being at the same level as the young girl, Dandridge distorts his posture in such a way as to make him be that he is looking up at the young girl, almost in admiration, much like the dog, whom is a symbol of loyalty. So why does Dandridge do this? The short answer is that he is attempting to equate the African boy's loyalty to that of the dog. They are both positioned in such a way as to give their admiration and attention to the young girl. It is also a way of show the owner of the portrait, or it's also a way for the owner of the portrait to show or to say that he has command over nature and that he has domesticated both man and beast, and both of them are loyal. And it's also interesting to note here that both the dog and the African servant page here have the same collar on. It's this wide band with a ball, almost like a ball on the end of it. The ways in which African figures are placed and positioned in paintings often alluded to a preconceived notion of superiority. This becomes more obvious when English artist Peter Lely's popular painting of young Elizabeth Cooper and an African page was reproduced as a print. Cooper is depicted with a very white skin tone, while the African has a much darker tone. In a mezzotint version of this painting includes 4 lines of verse. They read, "Beauty commands submission as its due, nor it's the slave alone that owns this true. Much fairer youth shall this just tribute pay, none fate deplore but thankfully obey." So what does this verse tell us? Well, we must submit to beauty, of course, and not only is it the slave that must obey, but everyone to she of fairer skin. So fair skin, therefore, equals beauty. We see these poses that suggest admiration time and again in portraits and paintings. This French genre painting titled The Escaped Bird is complete with romantic landscape, Baroque architecture, a fashionable lady who is elegantly posed, and an African servant. He, the African servant, is posed in such a way that it's almost comical. Stretched out across the foreground, he looks at the lady after what we can only presume is accidentally letting a bird out of a cage. Perhaps what the artist is implying here is that not everything can be domesticated. Either way, the boy looks up at the lady in admiration and hoping for forgiveness. And his attire almost, we've noticed this a little bit earlier, his attire is almost that of like a court jester too, so something else to take into consideration when looking at this. And then he also has that collar on, a very wide band collar there. Admiration, obedience, loyalty, and loyalty can be seen in so many elements of these paintings, whether it is a collar, the pairing of an African figure with a dog, the longing gaze of a central figure, or placement of individuals in a scene. The hierarchy and suggestive undertones become more obvious to the viewer. But I think all that changes towards the end of the 18th century. The positioning and posturing of enslaved Africans gets turned on its head in the late 18th century, due in part to the abolitionist movement. With Josiah Wedgwood's abolitionist medallion of a kneeling slave looking up comes to symbolize something new. It is now a sign of hope and mercy. This new symbolism is able to spread much more quickly thanks in part to Wedgwood's ability to mass produce this image. Wedgwood cleverly takes the image of the lowly enslaved African and uses it against those who oppress them. He even includes the text, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which brings the enslaved figure up from a lower status and suggests that he is more an equal. Wedgwood takes advantage of this posture in order to gain support for the abolitionist movement. Wedgwood's abolitionist imagery is best known in its medallion or seal form, but can also be found in others, and the DAR Museum has such examples as ceramics, metals, and textiles. And this is only a few of what we have in our collection. The placement of an enslaved figure lower down so as to look up at another transformed from being a subordinate posture to one of pleading for mercy as the abolitionist movement gained momentum into the 19th century. While the depictions of African figures as inferior or subordinate did not completely disappear from artistic license at the start of the 19th century, we see less and less of it used by European artists in particular around this time period. And lastly, before we go, I wanted to quickly mention how artists today are reclaiming the use of these images and reinterpreting them. The two artists that come to mind when I think of this are Kehinde Wiley and Titus Kaphar. Wiley, who was recently selected by the Obamas as the artist who will execute one of their portraits, is best known for asking people, usually African Americans, to select a piece of historic art and replace the current figures with modern individuals. Wiley's paintings resemble Renaissance-style portraits and paintings, but have a touch of modern flair to them. Today, Kehinde Wiley has works in the collections of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Met, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and more. Then there's Titus Kaphar. He, on the other hand, takes historic images and paintings done in a specific art historical style and removes, sometimes physically, figures and elements to reveal the black figure within them, or as he puts it, those who are often overlooked. Kaphar takes an image where an African figure may be quickly overlooked and makes them the central figure in these works. Kafar's works can be found in the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and in the Berger Collection in Switzerland, just to name a few. So the next time you walk up to one of these fine paintings, don't forget that a lot of thought goes into them. You should absolutely admire the color palette the artist selected, the details of the fabrics, the distribution of the figures, and the application of the brushstroke. But don't forget to take a step back and look at everyone and everything, because you'll be surprised at what you might find. Thank you.